and welcome to the CBC Teens Podcast. I hope you're having a wonderful time there at your homes. We have another exciting edition of the Good Conversation interview here today. Today's guest is Pastor Emeritus Kevin Folger, who was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. He was on staff at Cleveland Baptist Church for 41 years and pastored for 24 of those years. This past June 2019, he was reassigned from the pastorate of the Cleveland Baptist Church to the North American Director of Spiritual Leadership Asia. Listen in as Pastor Folger breaks down the call of God, missions work, and a whole lot more. Today, we have Pastor Emeritus, Pastor Folger. Pastor, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Brother Wissam. Thanks for the opportunity to be on your podcast today.
Oh, very excited, and we're all very excited to hear from you and some of your perspective and the adventures that you've had along the way serving the Lord.
Yeah, it's a joy.
Well, a lot of the things that we've been discussing have to deal with ministry and have to deal with the call of God. And so I'm waving at our UPS guy. Hey man, what's going on? Good to see you. God bless you, my brother. And so things have just been pretty exciting in different ways around here. And so we're going to ask Pastor Folger just a series of questions. Pastor Folger, he was the man that ordained me to the ministry, and it's a decision he says that he regrets every day. Is that correct? So, well, anyway, Pastor, I just wanted to ask you, how did you know God was calling you to the ministry?
My story goes back a long ways. I was a young person growing up here in the church. I was probably maybe third or fourth grade, and our church went away to camp. It was the Ohio Baptist Acres. It's down near Massillon. It's a camp that was owned and operated by the Akron Baptist Temple, which was a church that really was the mother church to the Cleveland Baptist Church. I don't know if it was my first year at camp or my second year at camp, but I was third or fourth grade, and I was sitting in chapel. You know, that week God had just been working my heart. I had been saved when I was 5 years old here at the church. And of course, growing up in a home where we put a great premium on the things of God, it wasn't hard for me to consider that, you know, God may have something for me, although I didn't think that it was anything special about me. I just, as I was sitting there that week, I think it was Thursday, I just sensed stirring in my heart, specifically as I was talking about ministry and service and surrender. I remember getting up in that service and going to the front and kneeling at the altar and just basically surrendering my life, and said, God, if you want to use me, I'm available. Friday night of that camp, they always had a bonfire, and the young people would gather on the fire. And you know, if you were committing your life to be used to the Lord, you'd pick up a twig or a stick and throw it into the fire, indicating that your life was used to God to do His work and His will. So that was the early moments of my calling. I think as I got a little bit older, and growing up around things, I got to the point where I was, I think, a little bit, if I could use the word, maybe calloused. I got a little carnal. We didn't have a Christian school back in those days. I went to public school, and while I loved church and I loved my friends, a lot of my friends weren't probably the most spiritual people in the world. And so I got to the point where really I wasn't really interested in serving the Lord. I was interested in being in church, but I really didn't have a desire to really serve Christ. And that all changed when I was a junior in high school. I was really focused on money, focused on material things. I worked at the what was then the Pick and Pay store, which is now a Mark's store. It was at 150th and Purtis. And I went to Mid-Park High School, so I'd get in my car after work, or after school. We were living out in Brook Park back in those days. I'd swing into the Pick and Pay store and work from like 4 o'clock till they closed at 6, a couple days a week, and then I'd work pretty much all day on Saturday. But I was really focused on money. I was focused on, doing what I wanted to do. And I had my plans. I had plans for my own life that I don't know that were God's plans. And in fact, I know they weren't God's plans. They were just my plans. And when 1974 rolled around, God did a work in my heart. That really changed. God changed the direction of my life. He changed me. And from that moment on, I haven't looked back.
Tell us about your call to missions.
In 1973, 1974, I had gone into high school. We were again in a secular high school, public high school. I was going to Mid-Park. And again, there was a number of young people from our church that lived out in that area. We were in high school together. Our youth department was filled with kids from various high schools, Westlake, inner city, high schools, Lincoln West, West Tech, John Marshall, all those high schools that are still, some of them very much vibrant around here. So we all come together and we had a great time, but I don't know how spiritual really our youth department was back in those days. We were, I think, focused on some things, and I'm sure there were some serious and spiritual young people, but some of us weren't. Probably much like today, Anyway, 1974 rolls around. It was March, and our church, like this week, was going into its missions conference. And Pastor Thompson, of course, the founding pastor of the church, had invited a former missionary by the name of Jack Baskins. And I think at that point, Brother Baskins, either he was a missionary or he had just come off the field. He had been a missionary to Korea. God had used him to establish a great church there in Seoul. And God just had his hand on that man's life. And I just remember that missions conference as being very unusual. And it was a Thursday night. I can take you to the place in the auditorium where God had worked in my life that night. As I recall, a number of our young people from our church and youth department just got right with God and surrendered and said, hey, my life is available. And that night, as I said, I had a few moments ago, I mentioned that, my focus really at that point in my life was not God's focus. And God got a hold of my heart that night. And I remember walking to the altar and saying, Lord, you called me when I was, a young man, and I've kind of gotten away from that. And tonight I sense that you're recommitting that, or you're speaking to me about that, and I get it. I get the fact that you've got something for me. And Lord, if it's missions, then I surrender to missions. And so because it was a missions conference, and because I think it was just something very tender in my heart, I said, God, if you want me to be involved in missions, I will. That was 1974. I finished high school and graduated in 1975. Actually, Heritage opened in 1974-75 school year. I left public school and finished my last year of high school at Heritage Christian School. Everything was just getting off the ground. Really wasn't much of a sports team, basketball, soccer, baseball, any of that stuff. We didn't have a gym. We had the area that's the HBI Chapel is the area that was our gymnasium, if you can imagine. And they were just piecing things together, but I wanted to be a part of it. So, I was working. I went to school in the morning, worked in the afternoon, and all that was because I was saving money to go away to college. And then I work all day on Saturday. And in August of 1975, I left Cleveland and drove to Springfield, Missouri, where I enrolled at Baptist Bible College and became a missions major, just because I thought, well, if this is God's call for my life, I want to be prepared for it. If God wants me to do something else, then the missions aspect won't hurt me at all. But really, that's really, when you want to boil it down, that's really my call to missions. I don't know that I've ever been specifically said, God says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to be a missionary. I just surrendered and said, God, if you want me to be a missionary, I'll be a missionary. So I suppose more than anything else, it was just a surrender to the general call of God and not necessarily knowing where it's going to take me. But I'm sure glad I did. It was awesome. It's been an awesome life.
So there was a time where you were sincerely praying about Singapore. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was in my final year of college. I'd met and married my wife. We were finishing up, and it was Christmas. We were coming home for Christmas. My dad called me, who was serving as the youth pastor at the church, Brother Bob Folger, and he said, hey, Kevin, when you come home, Pastor Thompson would like to have a meeting with you. He said, I think he's going to offer you an opportunity to come and serve on staff. Well, I was thrilled. I was thinking there's no greater place to come than your home church. And of course, I thought highly of Brother Thompson, highly of Cleveland Baptist Church. And so when I came in and sat down with him, he said, look, I know that you're finishing school. And he said, you probably need to serve an internship before you go to the mission field. So I'd like to invite you to come and serve on the staff. So I thought, well, I'll be here for a year or two. And so when I was here for about a year, he and I had been discussing different opportunities. And I'd always had a heart for the Southeast Asia. Specifically, when I was in college, I was interested in the Philippines. A guy by the name of Bob Hughes, I don't know if that name means anything, but Bob Hughes was a great missionary to the Philippines, and he had actually passed away my final year of college, died of cancer. He wasn't a very old man, but God had used him tremendously, specifically in a place called Cebu City. Established a great church there, and God used him tremendously. And then, of course, we had supported the Boyd Lyons family to the Philippines, and I remembered him as a young man growing up. And so I had the opportunity to, obviously, in college, to meet a lot of people, and specifically missionaries of the Philippines. And I like the Philippines because one of the things is that you could go there and speak English. You really didn't have to really learn a language, although, Tagalog is the national language. But when we got here, I kind of lost my thought about the Philippines, and there was a man who came through here, and his name was Sing Go. And Sing Go was a national from Singapore, and he was a man who I think was getting his support through BEMA, which was a national mission organization located in Columbus, Ohio. And as Brother Go and I had the opportunity to speak, he invited me to come and spend some time at the work that he was doing there in Singapore. He was actually home on furlough. So we made arrangements, and Pastor Thompson and the church made it possible for me to take a trip. On my way over there, I stopped by Tokyo. First, I spent a night in Tokyo. It's really strange. I'd never been on a jet airplane, never been on an airplane, a commercial airliner until that time. Flew from Cleveland to Chicago, and then from Chicago on nonstop flight to Tokyo. It was weird, because I didn't speak the language, and I'd never been away from home other than just being a married man in college, but I'd never been overseas, and so this is all a new experience for me. I got up the next morning, took a bullet train into downtown Tokyo, and kind of looked around a little bit, got back on the train, and headed back to Cleveland, and got back to the airport, got on the airplane and flew to Hong Kong. Spent 2 nights in Hong Kong, and again, I didn't know anybody, just walked around looking at the city. And then finally arrived in Singapore, was met by some of the young people, the younger folks who were making up the church there. A young man by the name of Kai Hawk was kind of the young man who really was my host, and a young man perhaps my age, maybe a little bit older, a little bit younger, I can't remember now. But anyway, we spent a lot of time together, and he was instrumental there in that church. And so I did all the preaching for a couple of weeks there, taught in their Bible college, their Bible institute that they had going. And I could see a great work. Of course, he showed me around. Singapore is a small country. It's a city country, really. It's just not very big, but very mass as far as population is concerned. Huge population squeezed into a small area. Tightly governed. Going forward, think about a technologically advanced city, a very clean city, had great potential. And so I looked at Singapore with great interest. And once again, a lot of the young people there would speak English. Chinese Mandarin was probably the key language there, but it was kind of a melting pot of Asians. So anyway, I left there thinking, man, there's great potential here. But when I left there, I had really an uneasiness in my heart that I just didn't have a peace. I had no peace that this is what God had for me, although I felt a compulsion because I was a missions major in here as a missionary intern that I had to go do something. And so I came back and said, well, yeah, that's what we're going to do. But as time went on, that uneasiness just really grew, and I had to settle it. And so one night, I just got alone with the Lord, and I just settled it, and I said, Lord, I need to know what you have for me. And it's like God spoke to my heart and said, I don't want you to go to Singapore. I don't want you on the mission field at this point. So I came in the next day, sat down with Pastor Thompson in his office, and I said, I don't know how to tell you this other than just the fact that I just sense that God isn't calling me to missions at this point. I feel like I've surrendered to it, but I don't know that I'm directly called to it. And he looked at me and said, good, I didn't think that you belonged in the mission field, but I couldn't tell you that, So it just confirmed that I had heard from the Lord. And then he said to me, you can stay as long as you want. Well, I'd been here like 2 years at that point. I had no idea where things were going. My thought was that I would stay here for a little while and then eventually go off and pastor somewhere. And as much as I tried to leave here through the years, God never opened a door, never gave us clear direction or peace. Never got a calling anyplace else. Nobody else wanted us, I guess. But after a while, Pastor Tom said, I'd been here 5 years, and he started talking to me about the future, and that he thought perhaps that God had sent me here specifically for him to train to be his successor. And those 5 years from there went on for another 12 years. So I'd served 17 years. And then in September of 1995, of course, I became the senior pastor of the church and served in that capacity for almost 24 years.
How many years did you overlap with Pastor Thompson as a co-pastor?
As a co-pastor, it was 5 years, from 1990 to 1995, yeah. So from June of 1990 to September of 1995, so a little over 5 years.
So you and Pastor Pete would have overlapped, I think, 3 years.
Then. Yes, sir. Actually, I had anticipated that I'd still be pastoring the church this year. Yeah. And yet I sensed God was moving up my timeline, and I was, that's what you want, Lord, that's what I'm willing to do.
Well, that concludes part one of the Good Conversation interview. Please continue to part two. Why do you think God called you to missions as a young man and reignited that same passion 40 plus years later?
Well, I'm not ashamed to say I'm 62 years of age,
Well,
and I feel like I'm a young 62. So, but I think I really come back to the fact that I can answer why did God call me. I think it's just a matter of surrender. I think it's a matter of us just being surrendered to God's plan. We sometimes in our minds say, well, God's called this person to be a pastor, but how many times have we seen pastors resign a pastorate and go to the mission field? Or how many times have we seen missionaries leave the mission field to come home and pastor a church? So I think there's a sense in which, there just needs to be a sense of surrender to the Lord. And God's calling is without repentance. So in other words, if we're surrendered, God, whatever you have for me, whatever you want me to do, that's what I want to do. And to me, that's what my life has been about, is just say, I want to be in the center of your will. And I want to be where you want me to be today. And if you change that, then I just need to be open to it. I just want to be surrendered to it.
While this may be impossible to answer, is there any possible connection with real revival and God allowing this virus to enter our world?
Well, as you said, it's impossible to answer that question. I think one of two things are happening. I think either God is preparing us for a great moving of His Spirit, or He's preparing this world for the tribulation period and the second coming of what we call the rapture of the church, and then obviously at the end of 7 years, the second coming of Christ to establish His kingdom. One of those two things I think has to happen. I'm of the persuasion that I think in every generation the devil, because he doesn't know the mind of God, has always had a person that could step into place to be the Antichrist. Sure. I believe that. But it's not going to happen until God's timing is ready. I do believe that God has taken so much out of our life, and we're not at the end of this yet. I don't know how much longer this thing's going to go on. We look at the things beginning to gradually lift here in May. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? I just know the more that God takes away from us, the more that God removes from us, the more externals, we're secure in our ability to take care of ourselves. We have jobs and we can go where we want to. Well, much of that's been removed. Sure. So what does that do? Well, it forces us, and I think, because we still have technology, because we still have phones and we still have an internet, still some of the distractions and noise are still there. But thank God for capitalizing on that. I mean, think about this, 10 years ago, you and I wouldn't be sitting here doing this conversation because that technology just wasn't available unless you were really high end. And now, what we're doing here with a couple of phones and, a few microphones that, things have been developed. It's amazing what can take place. But I do believe that God, He's either preparing us to send a revival, or He's preparing us for, the rapture, one of the two.
So revival or rapture?
That's my thought. Obviously it could be something entirely different, but the way that I'm seeing this, I think it's going to be one or the other.
Is this virus indicative of God's judgment? Can you explain why this is not tribulation for believers?
Well, again, I don't know that we can know the mind of God completely. So we can't say, well, God is judging us for this, that, or the other thing. There's certainly plenty of things that God could judge us for if He wanted to, But we also know that God's a God of mercy. We are not Israel, so we don't have a covenant with God as a nation, although our nation, the United States of America, has had a history of Christianity. But, quite honestly, as we look at the world, the entire world is really facing this thing. It's not just one nation or people. So for us to say, well, this is the judgment of God, as I said, I think God, if we look at what God has said, I was reading specifically this morning the book of Matthew. That was part of my devotions. I'm in a Bible reading program that has me reading 10 chapters every morning, but they're different books of the Bible. So it's a 250-day program. So in really 250 days, less than a year, I'll read through the Bible more than twice. And so it's an interesting program. But I was in Matthew 24 today. And of course, if you know anything about Matthew 24 and 25, that's what we call the Olivet Discourse, where the Lord talks about what's going to happen in the end days. And I believe those are talking about the tribulation period, and specifically speaking of the nation of Israel. And so as I was reading that, He talked about famine and pestilence. Pestilence, of course, is disease. So he makes this statement. He said, these are the beginning of sorrows. And He said, when you see these things, lift up your head because your redemption is drawing nigh. So I do believe that, part of what has to happen in preparation for the second coming of Jesus Christ is the world has to be prepared, and part of that preparation is for us to have perhaps our sovereignty removed. So America's been a sovereign nation, but what has to happen during the tribulation period has to come a world ruler, and that world ruler has to be able to manipulate and be able to give commands, and all nations align. So there has to be something that brings that together or brings that about, And I think part of that, of course, will be the rapture, when hundreds of millions of people are removed from this earth instantaneously. Talk about chaotic. And then, of course, we begin to read. But so I don't think there's any possible way we could say this is tribulation, because we believe that some things have to set up the tribulation period. So I would never say that what we're experiencing right now is tribulation, because I'm certainly a firm believer that God has not called his people to wrath, but to mercy. And so those of us who know Christ, we believe will be removed before the tribulation period begins. But it could be the setup of the tribulation period, or at least one step of several that would lead us there.
What advice do you have for teens struggling with God's call in their life?
Well, I think it goes back to something I said a few moments ago, and it's even something I said on Monday when we did the panel discussion with Brother Mac and Brother Mickey and Pastor. I do think that there's one thing that young people need to do, and if I can speak to you directly, young people, as you're watching this podcast, if you've not surrendered your life completely to God, in other words, just say, Lord, I don't know what you have for me. I don't know what your plan is for my life. But whatever it is, I want to be in the middle of it, and I'm surrendered to your will and to your plan. And can I tell you this, Brother Wissam, young people are afraid of that. They're afraid of what that may mean. Where's God going to send me? But I'm here to tell you that God loves us so much that he's never going to make us do something that we're not comfortable with or that he hasn't created us for. It's like a piece in a puzzle, it fits someplace in that master design of that puzzle. It's not going to fit anyplace else. And so many young people, I think sometimes, and even adults, are not in the plan of God for their life because they just never have surrendered and allowing God to move them to that place. And I just will have to tell you, a guy who's lived on this planet for 62 years, there's no place better than to be in the center of God's plan for your life and being surrendered to it.
Would you say that each decision comes with its share of tension? Mm-hmm. This one was hard for this reason.
Sure.
But when you make that decision, does it make the next decision easier, or does it make it more hard, in your opinion?
No, I think it makes it easier. I think every time we make a decision, every time we make a step in the right direction, the next step becomes a little easier. It doesn't mean it have its own challenges. Sure. I mean, it wasn't an easy thing for me to resign this church. I mean, I lived a comfortable life. I mean, not that I'm not comfortable now, but this church very well took care of me. It wasn't rich, but I had many things that came along with perks with the office, so to speak, and I was well respected and well received. And when you're the pastor of Cleveland Baptist Church, almost everybody knows who you are, and so you step out of that particular thing, and there's an element in which, okay, there's an unknown. I was moving to a ministry that is really kind of up to me to develop and a couple of other people. So I'm in a whole new realm right now, and I've never really had to call anybody for anything, other than just dealing with ministry. Now I'm calling pastors and sometimes looking for meetings and opportunities. And right now I'm setting. I'm just waiting for this thing to kind of lift so I can get on with my life and ministry. So it's a little different than it would be. So there are challenges. When I stepped into the pastorate here, while I was anxious about it, boy, the weight of responsibility was so much different than when I was just, can I say this, just a co-pastor? Because there was the other man who was the pastor, and I was there to help him, but then all of a sudden he's gone, and now I'm in that position, and every responsibility of this ministry, while it's the Lord's, humanly speaking, it becomes yours. So there are challenges in every aspect of your life, but as we make those steps, I think the next one becomes easier.
What general advice do you have for teens as a whole?
Well, again, I think, you got your life ahead of you, however much that may be. And, as a guy who's lived a good portion of my life, I've got more living behind me than I have ahead of me, even, regardless of whether Jesus comes today or I live to be 85 or 90, I've still got more behind me than I have ahead of me. I will tell you that, there's no better life than to serve the Lord. And that doesn't mean you have to be in full-time ministry. It just means have your heart surrendered to the things of God. If God wants you to be a Christian doctor, or a lawyer, or a business guy, man, you can serve the Lord in that regard. Just be involved in your local church. Be involved in the things of God. Read your Bible, pray every day, walk with God, and raise your family in the things of God. But, be open to the fact that God may be calling you. And if He is, if you have a heart for those things, you have an interest in those things, pursue them and get involved. If you're sitting on the sidelines and not involved in the youth ministry the way you should be, right now it's kind of hard to be involved much in anything other than just, being engaged in the online stuff. But one of these days when this thing lifts, get engaged. Go on, be involved in a bus route, sing in the choir, use the gifts and talents that God has given you. Don't be just one of those pew warmers. Do something for God. That's what I would say.
Is there anything else you want to add to this conversation? Things that you maybe you want to expand on or anything like that?
Well, I just would say that, my dad as I said, was the youth pastor. And of course, he's been with the Lord for over 8 years now. But his voice still resonates in my heart, And my dad used to quote this verse, and I actually quoted it on Monday, but it's Romans 12:1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, in others completely, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So again, it comes down to surrender and just saying, Lord, here's my life. I don't know what you want me to do or how you want me to do it, but I'm open to whatever you have, and I'll gladly do what you direct me to do. I would also say to the young people, don't get too far ahead of yourself. In other words, just live your life today. Sure. And don't live 20 years down the road. Live right now. Live where you are. Do today what you know God wants you to do today. Get up tomorrow, do the same thing. And if you do that throughout your life, you're always going to be in the plan of God for your life. So
that's awesome.
So.
Well, certainly appreciate Pastor Folger for stopping by the CBC Teens podcast at the Good Conversation interview. If you have any further questions, a direct message, send a text, email. If you have a question for Pastor Folger, you can send that to him directly.
I'll give you two things. Number one, let me give you my email address. It's just kfolger@clevelandbaptist.org, kfolger@clevelandbaptist.org. Or my cell phone, if you want to text me, it's 216-408-4347, 216-408-4347. And again, I'd be happy to correspond with you. And of course, I always direct you to your pastor, your pastor or your youth pastor, regardless of those things. Or certainly, first of all, the first line would be your own parents. Let me also mention, if I can, that I'm on social media. So Kevin Folger at Facebook, and then also Kevin Folger, just run it together on Twitter. That's my handle on Twitter. And then on Instagram, it's Pastor KF. And I, again, be happy to have followers and folks that I can try to influence.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. Good night. God bless you. Have a good day. Well, that concludes the Good Conversation interview here today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please give us a like or a subscribe or share this. Maybe in the comments below, tell us who you would like to see on the interview. And it's been a lot of fun to do these, so let us know if you have any other questions. God bless you, my friend, and stay in the Word.